Okay, so I noticed that you actually got your start studying with. You mentioned you had some work. You did some workshops with the Mowelfund Film Institute. So maybe you can talk about that. But also, you studied with Mary Lou Diaz-Abaya, who I think is probably the most underrated filmmaker of the '80s. I think Carnal is an incredible film. So I'm just curious
Yeah.
what that was like, and what her school did for the industry. I guess in the '90s was when it was, and then the 2000s
I think
most.
the early 2000s, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I was exposed to cinema very early. My father is a filmmaker and he's friends with, a lot. It's a very small industry, so he's friends with like a lot of the veteran filmmakers from the 70s and 80s. And as a young teen, I was already making, video projects, short films with a mini DV format. It was the accessible format at the time. But I guess my first formal lessons in like the basics of film language and filmmaking was through a workshop called APFI, Asia Pacific Film Institute. And I think Marilu Diaz-Abaya was one of like the head lecturers there. And eventually she set up her own school in Antipolo, and then there was like a one edition where she held it in her own home, the Marilu Diaz-Abaya Film Institute, MDAFI. And the workshop I went to was just like a summer workshop for like filmmaking for teens, something like that. So it was just a small group of us, young students, and out of that workshop, we were able to make like a formal short film. And that was like my first official short film that got into a film festival and really helped, jumpstart my career as a filmmaker. So I owe a lot to direct director Marilu Diaz Abaya. And yeah, so a lot of my batchmates there eventually also got into the industry. Even Gino Santos is also a director uh, who was part of that workshop. Like we were like 14, 13 at the time, and we were making short films with like the mini DV cameras. And yeah, from there, I joined Cinemalaya, and that's like the real, I guess, the biggest platform locally that can
Mm.
help launch a filmmaker. And a lot of film festival programmers attend Cinemalaya, and that's where they scout new voices, and not just film festival programmers, but even like the studio heads here locally. And yeah, and from there, started making genre films and eventually got into um, working with streaming originals, into doing genre movies.
So the Harang that was not was that the film that you made
Oh
with
no, it was titled The Threshold. I don't think it's available online, but yeah, it went to a couple of festivals. I think went to Germany and Hanover. But Harang was, I guess that would be like the first film that I did that wasn't like a project or a requirement. So that was really out of, pocket and like pure passion. It was like a simple story, almost like a parable that could, just a couple of actors in an isolated location. And yeah, that was the first short film that got into Cinemalaya. So typically, when you get a short film in Cinemalaya, that's where you develop like your voice and find an audience. And eventually, when they open up the entries for full length films, if you had a short film with them in the past, it's easier to get selected for that local grant that Cinemalaya gives out. And that's how I was able to make Recorder, because I already had like a track record with them through Hara. And I was pretty young at the time. I was really lucky that, they saw the value in that film. I think I was like 16, 17 when I did that. And I was really just, doing it for fun, basically. I was still in college back then. And yeah, these are like really small independent films, maybe um like 100 to 200 US dollar budgets, and I got into a couple of film festivals. I think that was also the first time I went to the Hong Kong Film Festival. I think Brillante Mendoza was even there. And I think my dad also had a full-length film at the time, Cinemalaya Camera Obscura.
Hmm.
I don't know if you've seen the trailer of the film.
Yeah,
Uh,
I actually saw
it's
that.
like a silent movie. Yeah,
I saw it at
he like
Cinemalaya. Yeah,
recreated a silent film.
that was back in, I guess that
I
would
think
have
that was
2012,
20,
2013.
yeah, for Camera Obscura around that time. Or even earlier, because I remember Recorder, my first feature was 2013, so I think it's a bit earlier. Yeah.
Mm. Um, Recorder. So was Recorder, was that a Cinemalaya film, or did you also got independent funding for that, or you put the grant money towards it from a previous Cinemalaya
Yeah.
film?
Recorder was a Cinemalaya film. So the way Cinemalaya works is there's like they have this open submission where you submit like a feature length script. Usually there's like 100 to 150 submissions, and then they select like around 20. And then based on that short list, you have to pitch to them, the feasibility or how you plan to make this film. And then from there, they like select 10 finalists. And it's a very small grant. It's like 10,000 US, and you don't even get the whole thing. You get like a part of it first, and then you have to make the movie. But during our time, 2013, it was still, they didn't have that demands that they have now. Like now it's tougher because they require like DCP and like certain level of polish and camera. But back in our time, we could utilize what was available to us. So Recorder was like the perfect film for that because it was like a mixed format movie. I thought of a story that you could tell with that sort of treatment where you could like combine different different mediums to tell the story. So, Recorders part video 8, part CCTV, part webcam and black magic. So it's like a combination of different mediums, almost like a tribute to cinema as well. Being a second generation filmmaker, I couldn't help but like tell a story, a film about film and
Mhm.
film piracy to be more specific. And yeah, so Recorder was like my first feature that got into Cinemalaya and had the support of that grant, and you could kind of see like touches of Recorder you could see in my early short films like The Threshold, which was the Marilu Diaz-Abaya project. Like a brief premise on The Threshold. It's an experimental film where literally I was like pushing the footage, just using Adobe Premiere at the time. I was, I also edit my own films, and I was really like basically pushing the footage where this character goes through different rooms, and each room he gets into gets more and more layered with like post video effects until you reach the threshold where you can barely make out what's on screen, and then finally he opens the door to reality. So even with my earlier short films, I was already playing around with like different mediums, but more with digital. I guess maybe similar to what my dad did with like Super 8, and he really like pushed that medium when he did like his early experimental Super 8 films. I tried to do that, but with the digital format because it was the one that was accessible to me at the time.
I haven't been able to see, and maybe we can jump back and forth between what you're doing now a little bit and what you did starting out, but have you had the opportunity to really kind of push that experimental component in the genre films that you've
I
been working
guess, yeah, actually the last one of the last films I did was Deleter.
at?
It's a more, studio funded film. It's a horror movie more geared towards like a regional local audience. But even with that film, I mean, even with the title, I always thought of it as like the like a sibling to Recorder. I mean, the title like Recorder, and this one is Deleter, and it was about internet content moderators, people who had to like sift through all the media online and then censor the things that you're not allowed to see, in streaming and in social media. So with that horror movie, I kind of used like the same techniques with Recorder, where it's a lot of different mediums, cell phone footage, CCTV from like elevators, because as a content moderator, you're supposed to like watch all these different clips, and I think it kind of resonated with the younger audience here, especially now with like the TikTok generation, where just like content moderators, they go through different media and different clips really fast, and their attention span is shorter, and it's almost very makes you kind of apathetic, like and dumb as you just go through different media and just bombard your senses. So I think that element of deleter kind of worked with like the modern tastes of the local audience here, and I think it's also I think the success because deleter was quite a financial success locally. I think it also is because of the pandemic, like when
Mhm.
we were all stuck, in our homes. Like our only window to the outside world is our screens and our phones, and kind of mirrors the job of a content moderator, the character in the movie, and the viewing habits, I guess, changed. I think pre-pandemic there were a lot of romantic comedies and like feel-good movies locally, and then after the pandemic, like all the celebrity love teams, they're gone. It's all genre movies. It's all R-rated movies. Everyone watched like Squid Game and Black Mirror on Netflix. And because now all these like international content is so accessible even to the mass audience, you can kind of see like the shift in their preferences. So
Mm.
very interesting. Like even this, if you're familiar with like the Metro Manila Film Festival, it's like the biggest like local film festivals that is more geared towards the mass audience. It's changing. They're programming more genre movies, more R-rated movies, and the big comedies and the rom-coms are slowly uh, declining. So it's interesting. It's like an interesting shift. I think a lot of it has to do with the availability of, all these streamers coming in, not just Netflix, but even like Amazon and is really aggressive here, and HBO Asia and Disney Plus finally came into the Philippines. So yeah,
Yeah,
like it's a very dynamic time.
yeah, and I hope maybe after we've had a chance to talk about your films, we can get to your experience with the market. I'm having a little bit of trouble myself breaking through and reaching people from these big corporations that are kind of amorphous. It's hard to figure out who can you contact to figure out how they actually operate. So any inside baseball about that would be interesting. But it's so I like what you said here about the leader is kind of maybe it's breaking the formula, the rom-com formula, and that's in part a function of the streaming platforms coming in and introducing content, or just also the pandemic and what people are watching globally and
Yeah.
responding to. And do you see any parallel between like what you were talking about with um, the let's see here, the threshold, and kind of attempting to sort of break the medium to stack up multiple layers of mediation, or maybe recording media. I think you mentioned the Super 8 and the webcams and all of that. and then breaking through to the other side to reality after kind of layering and stacking all of these different kind of the mediating devices. In a sense,
Yeah.
maybe you are breaking the rom-com is a analogous to that, but can you also sort of do you have the opportunity to kind of break the genre of the horror film, for instance, like
I
maybe on a formal level?
And I think a lot of the innovations that you see with us Filipino filmmakers, again, it all boils down to like our lack of resources and budget. We're kind of forced to think inside the box instead of outside of it because of the restrictions. It's a third world country, a developing country. We have a small audience. I mean, even compared to like, our neighboring countries like Thailand or Indonesia, we don't have that many screens. We don't have a big enough, middle class audience that actually pays for tickets. So the budgets of our movies here are really, really small. And I think with like Threshold or Recorder and Deleter, a lot of that experimentation also came out because of the necessity, to really tell a story with such a limited budget. Like, for example, the advantage I had with Recorder is that the main character was a camera, a film pirate. So he would record movies in a movie theater with this mini DV camera, a Video 8 camera. So by having a main character holding a camera and then shooting him with another camera, you get two cameras immediately, and then one is a cheaper one that looks like a consumer camera, so you can actually shoot him walking the streets, taking extra footage without a permit because it looks like he's just like a random, tourist or something. And these techniques allowed us to make these films for such a small budget because you're getting, that footage, that coverage without having like a big professional setup with like three big cameras. So that's also the reason I thought of the film like Deleter. I mean, besides ha uh, needing it to be a genre movie because it's a studio financed. We were coming off the pandemic, so the budgets were really restrictive. We had to shoot safe and very like small scale stories that are isolated interior indoors, and that that experimentation was necessary. I had to think of a horror story that I could tell in an office. So with an office, you have like elevator, CCTV, a webcam for the main character working, and it's kind of like screen life. If you're familiar, like during the pandemic, a lot of
Mhm.
filmmakers really wanted to tell stories, but they couldn't, shoot outside with a professional crew. So a lot of filmmakers came up with like screen life films where it's all either webcams, Zoom meeting, even like horror films in the US. They had like a lot of these popular films that were more like Zoom horror stories. So I thought of like a concept like that with Deleter. So actually, like same with the Threshold. It's always been because we had to innovate because we didn't have resources, and I feel like that's the same reason my dad, for example, or the alternative filmmakers in the 80s shot with Super 8. It was out of necessity because at the time that was the accessible format. That was the home video format. And as a filmmaker, you really just want to make a film, no matter what. You know. And I think because that's what's available to you, you find ways to make a story out of that. So that's how I guess I approached it. That's why I used all those mediums.
The 80s independents were kind of militantly anti Hollywood and militantly anti-industrial
Yeah.
film, like especially somebody as outspoken as Nick Del Campo. And I
Yeah.
think that in one occasion when he participated, I did an interview with him, and he mentioned that he participated in a panel of judges. I don't know if it was which festival it was, if it was MMFF or a different festival where they refused to give out an award and this would have been
Yeah,
1987
I think
or somewhere thereabouts.
or the Manila Film Festival, like the older one. They don't even have that. They still call it like the Manila Film Festival.
Yeah, apparently it created quite a scandal, but it was supposed to be critiquing the industry for not
Yeah.
doing innovative filmmaking and not touching upon also political subjects. Just having had the EDSA happen. So there was a kind of anyway, there was a kind of an anti-Hollywood militancy to that generation, and they embraced making short films because it was different from Hollywood and different from the status quo. And I think maybe there's still the at least as I've experienced it in Cinemalaya, that the short films, the low budget films, and maybe it even impacts the indie film movement as it comes up in the 90s. Um, Brilliante Mendoza and Bing Lau, I've read an interview where they also embrace the condition of having a low budget, and that can actually motivate a better story.
Yeah, the found story method, yeah,
Mm.
and
So
using what's available to you, yeah, and what's authentic to you. Yeah.
they call it the found story method.
Oh yeah, I mean Bing Lao, right?
Mhm.
Had they kind of like have these workshops on found story, on the technique of using what you find basically around you, the locations, the people, the setting, the milieu, the technology that you have. So it's really just making use and trying to find a story that is organic, that exists around you. So a lot of the early Cinemalaya films, had to adapt that, very real-time, neo-realist, very real locations, non-actors, and that was necessary, of course, at the time. Even with pre-recorder, the budgets were even smaller. But again, like I said, it's getting harder and harder now, because the demands are just more difficult. There's a certain polish that is like required, not just Cinemalaya. I mean, even streamers, right? They have like a certain technical spec level that you need to hit, in order to get that, distribution. So it's kind of tougher now. Even I talk to a lot of my interns or new students. Even the thesis films now are more expensive than they were when we were making shorts with the mini DV. I guess it's also because of like I said, accessibility and exposure to international cinema, and even like YouTube shorts and everything. Everything looks there's a certain standard now, and it's getting harder. But of course, there's still like experimental films that still use older mediums, and even Gawad CCP is also where I started. I think Threshold won like the first place experimental film award in Gawad CCP, which is like the older short film festival, alongside Cinemalaya. And that's where you can find more like avant-garde, like groundbreaking, more independent uh, type of films that are done by mostly students, submit there. So yeah, I'm glad that it's still around, and they're still very active, and they still get a lot of you know submissions, and they program really good short films.
There is a so like the I don't know if is there a tension so like between so um Harang, for instance, you mentioned it's a parable, and so I guess there's sort of a moral story there, uh, and then I guess you have this sort of more pure experimentalism, which is not story based or narrative based. Is there a tension there that you see in coming out of these festival environments? And maybe is that something that you've experienced, or like Harang reminds me of your dad's Anino, which maybe has a even more ambiguous sort of moral. It's not clear what the moral lesson is, but
Yeah.
there's this moral ambivalence that's sort of being maybe probed
It's
or
almost
something.
like an allegory. Yeah. I guess well, for me, Threshold is really experimental. Harang is more, almost like there's some crime thriller elements already showing, but it's more like a almost like allegory where the characters don't have names. There's just like the 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 robber and then the jeepney driver. And then there's like a literal harang means like barrier, right? And then there's like a literal barrier in the middle of the road, but everyone's also wearing like a mask, like a barrier hiding their face. And then there's like deception and distrust between everybody. So it's like a different type of narrative compared to Threshold. And then eventually Recorder, it's kind of like a mix of both, I guess, crime thriller, but with more experimental treatment. I guess personally, I like constantly trying something new. I mean, even with my genre work, um, I try not to stick to one genre because I like the excitement of challenging myself to like try a different treatment or try. I like the feeling of being a first time filmmaker in a new genre I haven't tried. So, uh, for example, like we finished a sports movie recently. It's not out yet. We're still in post production, and it's called Friendly Fire, and it's about competitive gaming, but done in like a sports drama genre. And we did a zombie movie, we did a Catholic ghost film, we did Birdshot, which is more like a coming of age, mystery thriller. So yeah, I mean, personally as a filmmaker, I like uh trying different things. But I guess like the unifying element is always like very morally ambiguous characters or like people getting in trouble with the authorities. Maybe it's like a subconscious fear of mine. And there's always like a crime element to it. So I think that's what links most of my films. I mean, if you think about it, even Anino and Manila Skies films that my dad made have that element to it. It's always like characters who are, morally ambiguous and they get in trouble with the police or with the authorities, or there's like a element of abuse of power. I guess it's like a Filipino fear, like
Mm.
there's like we always have like likable criminals and crooked cops, in our movies. And I guess that's like the unifying element. But yeah, I personally I like trying genres that allow me to, do a different treatment, do a different like language visually and in storytelling. So I guess that's why if even my shorts they're kind of like different. And, I always tell my students or in workshops to do a lot of micro budget shorts first and like try to like find what you enjoy doing, like experiment low stakes, low cost, and just like practice, practice, practice. Especially now it's so easy with like YouTube and with like online platforms. It's so easy to like get your shorts out there. And then after you make like several uh micro budget shorts, then you make like a more serious short film where you kind of zero in and what you want to try to say and try to do in terms of like craft and your message. And that's what you try to push to like Cinemalaya or these local festivals that really kind of like launch you. So I always tell them that like you have to first get obsessed with like the process, and I think you can achieve that through like micro budget shorts where you really get the practice.
Yeah, I wanted to circle back and talk more about like what does an environment like Cinemalaya or the festival circuit, what kind of environment and what sort of opportunities does it present as opposed to the streaming services, which you've mentioned. Well, on the one hand, it's a buffer. On the other hand, there are maybe technical specifications that are
Yeah.
limiting or genre specifications. But maybe before, or did you want to say something?
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay, before that, I wanted to mention, you said Birdshot. I was able to actually see Birdshot, and so I'm still looking forward to watching Deleter. Now that you mentioned it's on Viva, I was actually able to find it, and it's not doesn't seem to be region restricted. So no, it'd be very interesting to watch that based on what you said. But so Birdshot, so it's about crooked cops, and then maybe you have a soft spot for the protagonist, the farmer, and his daughter. Um, but I was also thinking about it in terms of, well, two things. There's the political element, and you're dealing with the national symbol of the Philippine eagle, and then there's also the genre aspect of it. So I was reminded there of, and also maybe there are certain themes that come up in like the political aspect, like the farmers who are killed is maybe a common political theme in on the it's the sort of cause on the left in the Philippines is the rights of farmers, right? That's sort of like the number
Yeah.
one historical issue on the left. And then the genre aspect. So I guess maybe first, before I pose the genre question, the political question, I was reading reading a review of the film by the MPP, the Minority ng Pilipino, and the reviewer mentioned they're discussing the police, and then the antagonist, or there's this power, but it's always in the shadows. It's never sort of immediately evident
Yeah.
what the malevolent force actually is. And then I was thinking about Bong Joon-ho's Memories of Murder,
Yeah.
where it's about the Gwangjun massacre, or the aftermath of the Gwangjun massacre and the dictatorship there, where the enemy is the public. Like there's that moment when the protagonist looks at the camera and out at the audience, and they are the guilty party. So do you thinking about how to pose a political question, is Birdshot at all possibly pointing a finger at the viewer and implicating them in the crimes that are represented in this
Maybe I
way?
guess,
Mm,
yeah, in a way, maybe not just the viewer, but like the system as a whole. In fact, the film ends with literally a bird's eye view. I always say that Birdshot is like a bird's eye view of everything wrong with the country. Kind of like zoom out at the end where you have this like crane shot, and there's I don't you've seen it, right?
I was
Birdshot.
able to see it, yeah, on
Yeah, and then you have
I
this
looked at it on Amazon, yeah,
maybe Netflix or
or
yeah,
Netflix.
and then there's this mass grave, right? So I
Mm,
think that was a time like it was partially inspired by like the Maguindanao massacre,
mm,
and yeah, also like all the land grabbing and abuse of police that was going on then. So um I think Birdshot, just like even other Filipino political thrillers, the malevolent force, or the real sinister forces in control of everything, they're always like a few levels out of reach, and you never really get to them, and they're never really brought into justice, and that's it reflects real life, like it's always like the underlings, or the people who have to execute these dirty tasks, are the ones that are like thrown in jail, or the whistleblowers. But you never really get to the to the root of it. The masterminds, they're always in the shadows, and it's more like the whole system is rotten. And in fact, Birdshot is literally also about corruption, like the anatomy of it, of how you become corrupt, like not just like systemic corruption with like the police parallel of the story, and then the more like corruption of innocence with the daughter father story. So it's like two different parallels with like a mentor character who's like morally damaged and morally gray, trying to survive, teaching a novice, a rookie, how to survive in this dog eat dog world. So it's literally about corruption of innocence with Maya, and then systemic corruption with like the police story with Domingo and Mendoza. So yeah, it's more of just like Harang, just like I guess some of my films, it feels like an allegory. It's more of like a collage, a bird's eye view of like the the pecking order of things, and how it's all systemic and it's inescapable in a way, and it keeps repeating. It's almost like a cycle. Birdshot, we even purposely made it kind of timeless. Like the uniforms of the police are old, like it's like late 80s, early 90s. But there's this very nomadic, isolated feeling to it. It's even like in a fictional province where it kind of feels timeless because and yet it's still relevant today. Like I still see people who watch it and streaming and then like make a review about it, and it still hits close to home because these are issues that keep repeating, and it's more a systemic problem. And that it's like that symbol of like the Philippine eagle, like the national symbol, being the silent witness of it all, from
Mm.
like a more objective bird's eye view, seeing ev- everything happening. So yeah, I mean that was like it wasn't as specific as like the more neo-realist political dramas during that time. And I think that's also what made it kind of stand out. There's this almost magic realism, fairy tale to it. Like if you notice, like the two innocent characters in the film, Domingo and Maya, they're the only ones who see like the ghost of the farmer in the forest. So there's like that layer of like magical realism to it, and I
Mm.
think people gravitated toward that those genre elements in Birdshot, and it made it feel a bit different compared to the movies that were coming out during that time. Yeah, and I think those genre elements were uh, part of my process of wanting to try something new, to experiment in terms of language and treatment. And I guess what it did was, whenever we make these films that might have like a heavy subtext or a heavy subject, we still want to reach like the wide local audience, because I think that's the audience that matters. You don't want to keep like preaching to the choir, the people who are already progressive and who already agree with you, but reaching a wide audience who wouldn't normally go out and see like a documentary or like a more niche film. Birdshot, hopefully, that's what we wanted to accomplish that. And the whole first Philippine Netflix deal really helped us because um it got that access to a lot of Filipinos. And yeah, we were really happy because that was like a full circle journey for me, because it was the opening film of Cinemalaya. So after like growing up as an audience member, and then short films in Cinemalaya, and then eventually Recorder was part of like the competition in Cinemalaya. Eventually with Birdshot, it was the opening film. And the good thing about the opening film, if you're familiar with the festival, is it's free. So it's like the first night of the festival, it's free, and it's held in like the biggest theater in CCP, the main theater. So like sometimes they run out of tickets because it's free and people really line up for it. So it was such a good feeling. Like it was full circle for us, and we got to show it to the audience that mattered. And Netflix was just like a big bonus because it really like widened the reach for Birdshot. And I feel like that kind of worked for us, like the genre elements mixed in with the subject kind of helped it, I guess, reach like more casual viewers, viewers who aren't even aware of the existence of Cinemalaya because of Netflix. they got to see it. So with that sort of philosophy that worked, we wanted to keep doing that, and I guess that's what kind of like pushed me towards trying to be more. I mean, compared to my dad does TV commercials for a living, but mostly does art house films and experimental films. But I guess the big difference with us is I really tried to aim and like work closer with like streamers and even local studios with the objective of trying to reach like your casual audience and trying to bring something a bit edgier, a bit different to them. So it is challenging, it's like a balancing act coming from very independent international film festival circuit route, and then trying to bring that in a more like streaming slash studio oriented route and try to satisfy like both sides of you. It's challenging, but it's also it's fun for us. It keeps us passionate, and I guess of course the major advantage is the financing is easier. It's different from like competing for grants, because I guess coming from the Philippines, like there's only like a certain type of film sometimes that gets grants, especially when it's competitive. You're competing against other countries trying to get a slot in a soft money in Europe or in Asia. But of course, when you work with streamers or with studios, it's more direct in terms of financing and development. So it's a bit easier that way, and you can kind of try more things, I guess. Because sometimes, I mean, not all grants or festivals, but sometimes, there's like a certain flavor, a certain niche that is expected sometimes of like the Filipino entry. So, it's like hard to pitch, like if you want to do like, for example, like the film we just did, like competitive gaming, that it's hard to get a grant for that, versus like a more politically charged, socially relevant Filipino movie. So I guess that's what working now with like streamers or studios allows us, is to kind of like dabble with like genre, but still try to tell very, very Filipino, very local stories.
That's why I'm going to be the leaders should be interesting, but actually I'm looking more forwards to watching Dead Kids, because I think maybe, as I understand the plot, you're doing this sort of dissection of Philippine society in this sort of is it a private college? Is that, or is it a high
Yeah,
school?
I guess Dead Kids is like set in an exclusive, high school, and it was a very interesting project because it's almost like trying to Trojan horse your way into like a bigger audience, because it was my first time trying a dark comedy, because I wanted to do a comedy this time, but still uh I think it's in the premise, but you know part of the film eventually deals with police abuse and extrajudicial killings, and it takes like a dark turn. There's like a genre bend at the end, but yeah, but the film is marketed that way as like uh, um, a high school, youth thriller movie that at the time there were a lot of new actors, new faces, so it was very fresh for like a more commercial audience. Like it was fresh for them to see like this very authentic chemistry between these new actors, and scheming to like kidnap the kid of a drug lord, basically. And by the way, it's based on a true story,
Mhm.
but it
Is it-
happened in a university, I think in Letran, where they kidnapped their own classmate and asked for a ransom. But here we set it in high school and kind of like treated like the high school hierarchy as like the microcosm of the outside world, of like the hierarchy of power, because the villain, the antagonist, is like the kid of a drug lord, and then your protagonist is like the kid of the police officer protecting the drug lord. So there's like that
Mm.
conflict of power between them. But it's also a comedy, so there's like a lot of like antics, and they're very amateurish in their planning of the kidnapping. So there's that like fun factor. Um,
And don't you
so
sort of,
yeah,
one of the characters comes from a lower social class who, and
yeah, yeah.
he's
Like the
such
the
a
the
trauma
main protagonist is like a scholar, and he
scholar
has to like
online.
rent. Yeah, he has to rent out his place like as a motel room for his rich classmates, and then he befriends the kid of the policeman, and then they plot to kind of use his apartment as like the holdout for the kidnapping. So it is loosely based on that real event, but we kind of tried to turn it into like almost like a heist movie, a youth dark comedy, but very tragic um genre bend at the end. So it was kind of an experiment, and admittedly it wasn't for everyone. Like not everyone understood, or maybe it just wasn't for them. Maybe they understood, but they didn't appreciate like the satire that we were going for. It's kind of difficult to kind of balance the tone of the humor and then suddenly turn serious. But it was a real hit with like younger audiences. So it was quite like um, very very entry level for a casual young audience to kind of get into that subject, to like question police authority or question the justice system, and yeah, it was interesting to see that, to see these new audience who are probably unaware of like a Cinemalaya type of film, and go into a film like Dead Kids, and then start that discussion online. So it was interesting to see that the buzz that happened when it came out uh, as a Netflix original. And it's very interesting that a lot of people thought that it was financed by Netflix, but actually, just like all our films, it's a very low budget movie that was financed by Globe Studios at the time, and Netflix acquired it and licensed it as an original after production. So we still shot it, just like my other films. It was shot like 10 days. In fact, recorded my first Cinemalaya movie was like 13 days. So it's even a bit bigger than Dead Kids. Dead Kids was pretty simple. We had simple sets, and it was all the characters in one frame. It's mostly like just their chemistry or riffing off each other, dialogue in one frame. But yeah, we shot it in like 10 days and very small budget, but because of the Netflix original branding, and thankfully it was polished enough. People really thought like it was a Netflix production, but it's more like a Netflix original after the fact. Like they liked the film, they liked the commercial potential of it, and that's why they took it in their label during post production, and then slapped their label there. It was the first Netflix original, so it was available not just in Asia. And yeah, I mean, it was pretty interesting because it got a lot of attention and buzz and debate online.
It was the first Netflix in Asia. What was it exactly that you
No,
just
no,
said?
the first Netflix original
Hmm.
from the Philippines.
Right.
Birdshot was the first internationally distributed Filipino film
Hmm.
on Netflix, and then Dead Kids was the first Netflix original, the one with like the like the big N logo at the start of the movie, a Netflix film. So
How does
it's
that?
a different deal. Yeah.
How does it qualify as an original if Globe was the initial
They
financier?
can do that. So it's like they can acquire something halfway through
Hmm.
and then agree to give it an original label, and then they come in post production. So like they put their title there, they put like the Netflix opening logo, and they market it more compared to like a regular second window acquisition. They call it second window acquisition when they get your movie as the second window because you've already like screened somewhere else or like did a theatrical run, then you come to Netflix. That's like a smaller deal
Mhm.
typically, but with an original, it's a bigger deal and they get it for like a longer licensing period. I think Dead Kids is like, I don't know if it's like 25 or 50 years,
Oh, wow.
while like Birdshot, it's interesting because Birdshot just expired this year. So it's the first Filipino film that got the Netflix distribution. And it's also the first to ever expire, I think, because that was like a 5-year deal. So now Birdshot is a free agent, so we can like kind of renew the license or maybe go to a different streaming platform with that film. But yeah,
Mhm.
so again, with the original, you're available in more territories, I think worldwide, or most territories worldwide, while if it's an acquisition, it's more regional dependent, so they can make a deal with you, like they can just take your film for like Southeast Asia or the whole of Asia, and then you can sell to other streamers or distributors elsewhere. I guess that's why the liter, for example, or yeah, the liter is only in Asia for Amazon Prime,
Yeah, I
but
couldn't
in
find
other
it.
territories, yeah, it's different streamers. So if you
What's
have a
that?
VPN, yeah, if you have a VPN, you can just set it to Asia, and then if
I
you know how to work a VPN,
I tried. Yeah, I might not be smart enough, but I tried using a
yeah,
VPN. I couldn't. They must have some good software that'll like sort
yeah,
of somehow recognizes when you're trying. You have to do it the right way.
and I think Neo Manila is also in Prime, but
Okay.
I'm not sure. I think it's also Asia. It's in Europe, but on a different like there's like a French streamer, and then there was like a UK one. So yeah, it's really how you like find different distribution options. So, but with like an original, they own everything, so like they just take it as a whole, and usually it's more, I mean, the goal is it's more than your budget, and then it's theirs. So they kind of the good thing about that is like they do their whole own marketing. Like they cut their own trailers, they do their own posters. Netflix does it for you. It's practically sold to them, so they can keep it for longer and show it in as much territories as they want. Versus like I said, the alternative, which is second window acquisition.
It's interesting that you called Dead Kids a Trojan horse, and you mentioned. Well, I think you mentioned it was the Trojan horse in terms of hooking your audience, hooking a new audience who might not be interested, but maybe also in terms of you also mentioned that it's not a film that would be sort of traditionally recognized by the international circuit because they would be like, well, this does isn't sort of quintessentially
Yeah.
Filipino, and maybe the way that
It's a
Birdshot.
bit it's a bit Western, admittedly. It's a very, I mean, like the heist movie, has that very, Ocean's 11. It has that very
Mm,
Western energy, but I guess to understand it from our perspective,
yeah.
that's fresh, for like a Filipino casual viewer. Like, wow, we have a Filipino heist movie. Like, I've never heard of that, because we're used to like big comedies or rom-coms. So when you see like young actors swearing a lot and they're gonna kidnap their drug lord classmates with guns and they're in high school, that's already unheard of here. So like there are things that I guess work here or that are fresh like to a Filipino POV, but it's not what maybe like an international film festival programmer would look for in terms of like Filipino cultural identity when they select a movie. And like as growing up as a filmmaker here, I personally have been, around since like mini DV days. You kind of understand that, like that
Mm.
the difference, of that those two paths, I guess, and those distribution methods, and you kind of like have to balance that, especially if you do it for a living. Like realistically, a lot of filmmakers either, they shoot TV commercials on the side, and then make feature films, or they usually do television, like weekly or even daily episodes that are really fast and quick. But on the side, they have a project that they're pitching around in festival project markets that is a bit more personal, more passion project. So it's challenging, economically here. I guess it's not like maybe in Hollywood or in the US where you can like make a feature film and like incubate for another 4 years. That's unheard of here unless you kind of like own your own studio or something. But yeah, like a lot of feature filmmakers here even work for, if you're familiar with like Viva Max, it's
Hmm.
like the streaming site of Viva that focuses more on like sexy films. Like it's coming back, they used to
Oh,
make these
hmm.
the Pito Pito films, like the
Yeah.
seven shooting day films
Yeah.
that were very economical and made a lot of sense, like in the late 80s and 90s. Now it's kind of coming back with like streaming and the digital age. And a lot of filmmakers actually from Cinemalaya, like they would make their passion projects through Cinemalaya, but their bread and butter would probably be these 7 day streaming movies or daily daily TV show episodes that are really quick, and of course like production value wise it's a bit different, but it's something you kind of learn how to balance and how to kind of adapt and not like lose yourself, you lose your voice in that.
Lino Broca's formula was to make 4 or 5 commercial films and then make one art flick. Is that still
Yeah.
viable today in the current context in the Philippines?
um it really depends, like there's a lot of filmmakers who could make, maybe I personally would max out at one a year. There was one year where I did two, and it was super exhausting. That was the zombie movie and Dead Kids. And that wasn't my fault. Like that wasn't intentional. Sometimes, you really just have to adjust based on like schedules of a lot of people, of cast and crew. And we're not like other countries who can just like exclusively lock out your crew or lock out your cast. Like we're just doing this one film for the whole year, even on break days. No, you can't do that. In fact, if you have a break day on your project, you have to understand that your crew, they're trying to survive. They'll take a different job on those break days, maybe shoot in TV, shoot a commercial. So it's unavoidable. So sometimes you really have to like overlap your opportunities as a freelancer, because if you don't, you can't predict what's going to happen next year. There might be another pandemic, you got to save up. So a lot of filmmakers have to like overlap, but me personally, I max out at one a year. I don't know how often, how prolific Lino Brocco was. I mean, that was like film, like 35 film. It was a bit, I guess, more meticulous and more intentional. If you really wanted to do a movie, then I don't know if they could make more than one a year. I'm not familiar with how fast he made those commercial movies, but here, yeah, most directors like they can do three, I guess. But I personally just do one. My dad does a bit slower, like he does like once every 4 or 6 years, I think. Yeah, I think I think he's done like maybe around 5 or 6 features. I'm already on my 10th, but it's because like again, like I went into like streaming and studio filmmaking, which is totally different from what he does for a living, which is commercials.
You mentioned
So
the
yeah,
Pito.
I guess.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. So you mentioned the Pito Pito, and I know this is from reading some of the critiques of Cinemalaya from Roland Tolentino. In this would have been, I guess, in the 2000s. Um, he was critiquing the Pito Pito kind of, I guess, industry, the structure of attempting to structurally critique the industry, and in part blaming this sort of rapid production environment for limiting the extent to which you could actually develop a national audience. because the industry didn't seem to be sort of, I guess, sustainable on an industrial level, as I understand him to mean. But then you have Bing Lao and Brilliante Mendoza, who are sort of embracing that model and attempting to use its limitations for creative purposes. Um, what's your take there? Because you've also talked about developing
Yeah,
a national audience, but using streaming to do it. But it's
yeah,
interesting that also you seem to be successfully using that sort of Pito Pito rapid production model as well.
yeah. I mean, honestly, like I'm already very lucky. I know it sounds a small, I guess, like in terms of international standards, but for example, my feature films now are anywhere from like 14 to 20 days, the films that I make. And that's already a lot. Like I mean, when I go to international film festivals, I talk to other filmmakers. I tell them I made my film for like 16 days, 17 days. They're quite shocked, like, wow, that's so small. Like how do you do that? But I know that here a lot of filmmakers, even for theatrical releases that are commercial movies, romantic movies or some genre movies, they shoot for like 6 days or 7 days. So I'm already very lucky that I guess a lot of it also has to do with like because some of the films I make have like bigger celebrities, so yeah, they're more taken care of by the studio. It's more like a bigger release for them. So I'm lucky in that sense that I got to that point. But I guess in general, to answer that question, is it it makes like a lot of economic sense why there is like a hard cap or a ceiling to the budgets of our movies. It's because if you go beyond like a certain amount, it's just not justifiable in the sense like there's not a big enough audience to sustain it, at least locally. That's why I think in my interview I mentioned you have to do like the 50-50 buffer with like an international audience because realistically I guess the middle class isn't that big in this country and we don't have a lot of screens. Plus, you're competing with Hollywood. So if you, I don't know exact data, but like let's say an average working class Filipino, it's already what, like almost $5 more, like $6 for a movie ticket. Um, beyond minimum wage. So let's say they can only watch like 5 movies in a year. Like, can your Filipino movie break into that top five if three of those will probably be Marvel movies and then maybe like a Pixar Disney movie or
Mm.
so you kind of have to understand that the people who will probably watch your movies are the people who can afford to see more than 10 a year, or maybe, people who have Amazon already have Netflix. So it's a different, it's a more niche crowd. It's a different crowd. But if you want to access like the mass audience, uh, it's really like there's like a certain type of film only that can grab their attention, and you have to understand that. Like, I mean, for them, it's sometimes it's just escapist cinema for them, and entertainment and spectacle, and that's what they they value, with that, with the money that they have. So there is like a certain number of audience. We have the data for that. For example, like the highest grossing Filipino movie is like 800 million pesos. What's that like in dollars? But
Mm.
that can only justify like a budget of around $2 million for a movie. If you think about it, because a movie has to make 3 times just to break even. So it's almost impossible. Like you need to have that big of an audience just to make a decently properly budgeted genre movie. So what happens is we're stuck with this ceiling unless we can find a way to like grow our audience outside as well, even though we're not English language. Because that's a challenge, it's Filipino language. Like it's harder to sell than like I guess established cinema like Korea with like strong ties to Netflix and genre cinema worldwide. So it's hard. So there's a certain limit, and I understand why that cap exists. Because if you go beyond that, like for sure you're not gonna break even. And these studios, of course, it's a business. They need to, you know, yeah, they have a payroll. Everyone employed by these movie studios. So there's a limit to that. So I guess sometimes it's surprising because some of the art house films that really take their time in getting grants for like 4 to 5 years, like a grant cycle, submitting to like um European soft money and co-production techniques. Sometimes their budgets are a lot bigger than like a commercial movie, with celebrities, and it's surprising because they can, risk that because it's soft money where there's no obligation to return, right? It's more like cultural grants and competitive grants. So yeah, I mean that's the reason why films today are like 7 days, 8 days, because even those films that are made for 7 days, sometimes they flop. In fact, realistically, it's since January, there's only one Filipino movie that made money, and that's the one that's out right now. If you know, A Very Good Girl,
Okay, I haven't.
because it's Catherine Bernardo. She's like the biggest star. In fact, the film I mentioned that is the highest grossing movie ever in the Philippines is starred her. So she's like
What's the name? What
she
was the
she's
biggest one, or what was the name of that particular film?
the biggest one is a rom-com called Hello Love Goodbye.
Okay.
And even before that, the second placer is still her movie. It's still Catherine Bernardo's movie. I think
Hmm.
so. It's
Hmm.
really based on the celebrity. So it's
Hmm.
shocking, right? Like since January, we've been releasing, like Viva has been releasing like a movie every week on theaters, and nothing has profited or maybe even broke even until this one. This one. So it's this the model is like they make multiple small films, and like out of those 10 multiple small films, 9 of those will flop and then one will suddenly break bank. Yeah. So that's like the model they're going for now. It's too risky to like use, like, instead of making 10 films, use all that money to make one big film.
Hmm.
I don't think it's sustainable at the moment. Maybe things were different like in the 70s and 80s, and there wasn't Netflix, there wasn't piracy, you didn't have cinema on your phone, and you weren't bombarded with all, moving images, so it was such a spectacle, maybe novelty. But now it's so available and everyone's home and everything's easier and accessible. So they reserve their money for like Oppenheimer on IMAX, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
Than spend it on a Filipino movie because it's the same price. So it's hard. It's very difficult, and a lot of these commercial movies just rely on the MMFF because there's like a enforced window where there's like 2 weeks starting Christmas. It's only Filipino movies,
Hmm.
so people don't have a choice, right?
Yeah.
So I guess maybe that's one way to do it. Like you need the government's help and legislation to kind of like force the issue, like no Hollywood movies, or there's like a certain quota. But the problem is it's complicated because now you're gonna get into conflict with the exhibitors, and exhibitors in our country is different from like in the US where you have like cinema chains. Here the cinemas are owned by the mall owners, right? We don't have like
Hmm.
cinema chains. It's more like malls have cinemas as like almost like a attraction. They don't really make money off the cinemas. It's just to attract you to go to the mall to shop. And they
Hmm.
have a cinema there that doesn't make money.
SM would own the
So
theaters in their own
yeah,
shopping.
SM, Robinsons for the provinces. It's more like Gaisano malls. And these malls, some malls have like what, two cinemas in them.
Hmm.
So let's say there's like 20 movies available. Of course, the two cinemas they'll put like the Nun, and then maybe like a Marvel movie. So it's really hard for like a Filipino film to really get in. So I guess that's where streaming came in to the rescue, like Amazon and Netflix, where they knew, but that's also a problem, I guess, because they know that they are your only option.
Mm-hmm.
If you really want if you want to make that investment back, so they know that you won't survive in cinemas unless you're like a star-studded, celebrity commercial movie. So they also have that bargaining power and leverage. So it's also very, of course, commercial with them. Like they still look at the genre, look at the actors. That matters a lot.
I
So
guess
there's
that.
not
Mhm.
a lot of avenues actually to make it like a sustainable engine. So it's still challenging for us, but once in a while we get like a random hit like Deleter was surprising for us. So that helped us a lot because it helped green light these next few films for us.
I guess that brings up the question again of taking risks and who bankrolls the risk and what can you do with the sort of status quo. So you mentioned the Catherine Bernard films, and I was thinking about, Broca worked with like Nora Anor, and if you look at a film like Bona, I guess
Yeah.
presumably one of the things he's doing is kind of subverting her stardom in that film by casting her in a certain like role as this sort of um, submissive, impoverished woman who, at the end, of course, she revolts against all of that.
Yeah.
Uh, is there an option to do something like a film like that with somebody like Catherine Bernard? And did you have that in mind with casting Medina
That's
Gray?
honestly, yeah, that's what I we tried to do. Like
Uh-huh.
it's a very conscious decision. Like the very first time I did like a studio movie, like coming from something as gritty as, let's say, Neo Manila, which is again shot in 10 days. It's like available locations. It's very neo-realist, real-time, handheld. It's about a hired gun, a mother who's looking for her son during the drug war. It's called Neo Manila, and it was a Q Cinema film, which is kind of like Cinemalaya, where you pitch, they give you a grant, it's soft money, no return of investment. You can do whatever you want if you're selected. So it's a passion project. I made this almost like uh, it's an assassin thriller, but it's more, a bit more art house, and played in festivals. We went to like Rotterdam, Shanghai, and everywhere. And then when we came back, we did a commercial movie called Eerie, which is like total opposite of something like Neo Manila. It's like a ghost story set in a Catholic school. Something very familiar, very, very relatable to a lot of Filipino students, a lot of young audiences. But what we did was we cast Bea Alonzo, who's like, you know, one of these big stars that has a lot of successful movies that are romantic films, with John Lloyd Cruz. I don't know if you know the classics like One More Chance, Four Sisters and a Wedding. So she's like this big star that's mostly romantic and had roles in romantic films. And then I cast Charo Santos, of course, like Mike Dillion's like muse, and she was at the time the CEO of ABS-CBN, Star Cinema, and I cast them in a horror movie and in Erie. So Cara Santos represented like the institution. She was like the mother superior, and then Bea Alonzo was this like guidance counselor who didn't have that like strong faith, but wanted to help her repressed Catholic students through psychotherapy, more scientific method. And they butt heads, and it's a ghost story, but there was that like that freshness, that novelty to seeing these actors in a horror movie for the first time together, fight like butting heads. I always tried to like peg it to like the movie Doubt, like with like Meryl Streep, like Charo Santos would like represent that, and they would butt heads in a horror movie. And it was my first ever attempt to do something with a more, of course, with a different set of objectives. You still want to tell this story that you develop, but at the same time, you had a very, you know, an obligation to the studio basically, and it worked. The formula worked. It was quite um financial success. I think it did like 210 million. So that's like on a budget of like 300,000. So that's like 300,000 US to like around $5 million. So it was a big success, and from that we kind of like learned, I guess, how to make films that are not your typical Filipino commercial movie, and a bit edgy, a bit. It was R-rated. It dealt with subjects like suicide and mental health,
Mm-hmm.
and we kind of did that again with the leader. Like Nadine, it was like Nadine's first lead in a horror movie, and it also worked out for the leader. So we're starting to see this new way, new approach that is also exciting, not just for us, but even the actors themselves. They like doing these films because they do the same romantic films all the time, and to them they're excited to try something new, to do an action movie, to do like a psychological thriller or horror. So it works out for them, it works for us, it works for the audience. And it's fresh, like I said, because now with Netflix and everything, their tastes are different. The younger generation are also looking for something a bit more edgier. So yeah, so it's been working out for us. And I don't know if you're aware, but after Deleter, we set up a studio called this one here, like Evolve Studios. So it's financed. So basically, the capital of Deleter was set up to make a company that would produce 1 to 2 genre movies a year for a more regional audience. So this time it's like a new hat for me as well, because this time I'm also producing films for other directors, but with the same philosophy or the same approach in trying to build that audience and make it sustainable and make it work, but at the same time find these films that are a bit more edgier, that are more genre oriented, and that has that in at the same time um that international appeal, so we can also sell it outside the region and maybe sell it to streaming after we do the theatrical run here. So that's like our new objective with like Evolve Studios. So Nocturno, the one coming out later this year, is the first movie, and then we're doing like a fencing movie for next year, and then another movie. So these are more like producing roles now, and it's pretty exciting because it's like a new chapter for me as well.
And you'll be working with arts with streamers on both of these films, or how does that factor? Right.
For Nocturno, it's more like a theatrical route, but of course, after theatrical, eventually you have to get it to a streamer. So yes, we're open to that. And then
Mm.
the other movie, it's more like a sports drama, like it's about female college fencing, but in the Philippines. So it's not your typical Filipino sport. It's something we feel is like a new aspirational type of story, and like a new world for a lot of viewers that they might be interested in, almost like Queen's Gambit, kind of like introduce a lot of people to chess. So we want to do something like that. So that might be for streaming, but we'll see if there is potential. Well, you can kind of tell very early on how when you like release promotional material, you can kind of tell if it's gonna fly like theatrically here, or if it's something that you have to go straight to streaming.
Mm.
So yeah, sometimes you kind of have to gauge it first. Um, but yeah, but it's a bit more feel good than, let's say, a horror movie. So it might work for like a summer release. And yeah, so that's our objective now with like Evolve. We wanna it's like we're using the studio financing, but we're allowing more, I guess, creative, like edgier genre films the chance to get like the green light and to find distribution. So with the next two films, I'm working with other filmmakers, and I'm more like a creative producer this time around. So to help
Mhm.
help them access as well like the network that we've developed through our filmography.
Getting back to that, yeah, very interesting. Getting back to the comparison with Bona, in Broca, maybe you could say that he's sort of subverting the melodrama genre to a certain extent, and then there's also maybe a little bit of feminist politics thrown in the mix there, and maybe a little bit heavy-handed. He really puts Philippe Salvador sort of through the pace at first, sort of Nora is sort of really demeaned by Philippe Salvador, and then of course the tables are turned, but in a very kind of violent way. I think I've seen two endings to that film. One where she throws the boiling water on him, and you see him like running around screaming, and then there's another one where they cut that out, and it's not. I don't know how those were distributed differently. Um, but so have you something like that in mind where you take the genre and then you maybe subvert it and you inject a political message with the leader, of course, you're taking up this kind of labor issue of working in the call centers.
Yeah, I mean, like for example, I guess the leader kind of highlighted this very clandestine, very obscure profession that is also fairly new because the internet is fairly new, which is content moderation and how it's not regulated. It's very secretive, and these workers need a lot of like support and mental health support, and yet uh, it's very sometimes it's a lot of it is illegal recruitment even, and they have to go through the stress of this job, and the psychological you know impact of this job is rarely discussed. It's been discussed in a few documentaries, but then again, like I mentioned, like the wider casual audience would probably never see those documentaries. So I guess with a horror film that played in theaters with like a popular actress, there was a lot of discussion on it. There was a lot of buzz and articles that came about because of it, because it's even just like the promotional material and trailer. We even had like a segment where the lead actress would do a one-on-one interview with one of these content moderators, these online censors, and it would generate a lot of discussion. So, with these like simple, I guess, um, like approach to having this type of subtext, but using genre as that vehicle to kind of push it to a bigger audience. You can see it, working. I mean, Dead Kids, yeah, even though it was more like a fun, youth thriller, by the end of it, you have people, discussing um, like the tragedy of the ending, and the selective justice and injustice that happens, and but told through a very youth oriented type of comedy movie. So yeah, we try to do that. We try to, I guess that's for me at least, it's an effective method of like getting your message across, and at the same time making it sustainable, so you get to do another one, instead of, I mean, the Birdshot route really helped us when it was our sophomore movie, because we didn't have a track record. It was my second film, just coming off of a very small independent film like Recorder. So you do have to go through that international competitive pitching method, but it takes years. But with this system, and with this I guess approach, working with studios and streamers, it's faster. It's like a more sustainable engine where you get to make the films you want, reach a big audience, which I feel like as a filmmaker that's important to me. Reaching a lot of people, um you're basically affecting more lives, and you get your message across to people that need to be persuaded, or people in the middle. You can even like sort of swing votes that way. If you really wanna create a bigger impact, you have to access the other side sometimes of the debate. And to do that, I think genre is very, very effective. um but yeah, but of course at the same time you need to be very aware of how to make it sustainable, make it profitable, or at least break even so you can do it again. Because otherwise it will take you another 3-4 years to kind of like recharge and find your footing, find your financing again. It's very tricky, but that's what we try to do. And with every project, we learn something new. We learn like something that we can kind of correct or fix in the next one.
Part of getting back to the point that I raised earlier about Rowan Tolentino and his critique of Cinemalaya was that it's a niche. Cinemalaya is just sort of producing a niche audience, and as opposed to developing a national audience. He was also kind of explicitly claiming that it was a middle class audience as opposed to a popular audience, and that so well, that maybe, and so okay, so there's that. But then you mentioned that the festival circuit is also an opportunity for directors to produce a kind of an art house film or to have more directorial freedom. And then, of course, you're also posing the national question and attempting to use streaming as a buffer to develop a national audience.
Yeah.
So, what's your take on this point?
I feel like if you're just being practical or pragmatic about it, the local festivals are there to help jumpstart a filmmaker to launch you, because realistically, even if you want to apply like the philosophy that we're trying to do, or even like let's say someone even bigger like Eric Mati, with like On the Job, by Bust, and these bigger productions. um Even if you want to follow that route, you can't do it right away, right? So you have to start somewhere that would risk financing on a first time filmmaker, and that's the local festivals. So if you track the careers of a lot of the active directors now working with like theatrical releases and studio movies or streaming movies, a lot of them started in Cinemalaya. So there's that utility to it, that Cinemalaya really, not just Cinemalaya, but Q Cinema really is a jump start, and a launching pad for a lot of new voices. And then once you're noticed there, you already have like a couple of films under your belt. Then maybe the streamers, the studios pay attention to you. Maybe your film was like the audience prize. Maybe you weren't the best film. Maybe you're not the film that was chosen to go to Busan, but you're the film that was kind of talked about by like the majority audience. So studios take notice. They get you to do a rom-com first, and then maybe if your rom-com does well, you get to do your thriller movie. um, so it's a launching pad that gets you a track record or a filmography strong enough for studios and streamers to trust you with more bulk investment, rather than like grants that are fragments that you have to kind of collect. Now they can like trust you with like a bulk of money and just make a movie right away. And then yeah, and then the next step is to make it a bit bigger so you have that international buffer. I mean, like even Eric Mati, right? He's trying to do that. I mean, On the Job 2 was like bought by HBO, was screened in Venice, but it's also popular, locally, because it's an action movie with a lot of big names, big celebrities. So, there's that almost like technique where you can kind of like balance all those elements. But to get there, you have to start somewhere, and those, I guess, that's the utility of these starting festivals. But at some point, you gotta progress. I mean, there's nothing wrong if you wanna hang out there and like continue making grant funded films, but again, realistically, it's not sustainable unless somehow you have like, I don't know, second generation wealth or something, or another job. But realistically you can't, grants can you can't survive off grants. So eventually you gotta use that as a launchpad and kind of progress into a more sustainable system to continue making movies, and then eventually make bigger movies that has that international buffer, but at the same time has the components that help make it successful locally as well. And yeah,
Mhm.
it hits differently when your local audience recognizes your movies. At first, of course, when you're starting a filmmaker, it's all about the film festival route and all that, but it's different like when you're like in a cab or you're in the grocery, and like people are familiar with your movie, people are familiar with, they've seen it and they paid tickets for it and they were affected by it. It just hits different, like, like you're getting somewhere with your films. It's not just the same echo chamber. It's the same faces, like when you go to film festivals, even internationally, when you go to project markets, it's the same programmers, it's the same crowd. Realistically, a film festival screening abroad has like maybe 100, 150 people, and usually your movie gets one or two slots per film festival. So yeah, that's quite a limited audience, like compared to like a box office run of um let's say 100 million pesos. It's not just about the money, right? It's about what that number represents is an audience. So if you divide that by the ticket price, that's like, I don't know, 500,000 Filipinos, right? Got to see your movie versus like 120 people in Europe. That's like a bigger impact, and it just hits differently if your movie can reach that big of audience in your home country. And it's even more satisfying if you're able to, like I said, like Trojan horse, or like somehow put a part of your that subtext that you want to tell, but make it easier, for them to digest, or to enjoy, I guess. Maybe that's the word, to kind of like entertain them and get engage them at the same time, if they are able to go through that layer. It's easy um to like aspire for it, but it's hard to do, honestly. It's hard to find that balance. Sometimes you go too much in one direction and the message is lost. So it is tricky, but I feel like, at least for me, it's a good approach to really start to develop uh, a real sustainable audience locally.
You mentioned the Trojan horse with dead kids and the Bing Lao kind of found story approach, that was part of what inspired Dead Kids. And you also said that there are some limitations to the festival, especially the international festival circuit, but I would propose also the local film circuit, like Cinemalaya. They are looking for national themes and
Yeah,
raising questions of national identity. They
yeah,
prioritize that historically. Um, so you might say, well, they would also think about like Birdshot is a film that maybe has this sort of national allegorical character in ways that Dead Kids doesn't. But I don't think you actually mentioned using that Bing Lao kind of found story approach with Birdshot. You mentioned the Maguindanao massacre, right? But that was journalists and not farmers.
yeah.
And so it seems to me that there are advantages, legitimate advantages to working with this kind of commercial approach with streamers and all of that you're describing, that are, you know, maybe you can get a more fresh result in certain respects, and there are fewer limitations in certain respects.
Yeah, well, yeah, definitely. Of course, there is a wider audience, when you're genre. Not just commercially, but let's say even in film festivals, right? You get the access. If your film is good enough, you get the access like these A-list festivals, but at the same time, you have a second wave of genre festivals. In fact, you can see it now, not just, in our region, but even in Hollywood. They have the elevated horror, the term A24, where it's it's kind of like genre and art house at the same time. So yeah, I mean, by I guess purposefully putting genre elements, and especially if you're a filmmaker that you sincerely and genuinely enjoy making genre films, but at the same time trying to put that more socially relevant or more politically charged, or I guess more personal, sometimes more personal message, and kind of try to balance it with genre, it gets farther. Like realistically, it has, of course, it has a bigger audience than something more niche, more art house, more esoteric. Um, so yeah, so it was, I guess you could say, like an intentional decision with Birdshot. Like there was elements of it that were kind of like a western. You had a climactic shootout. You had this nomadic characters that have to settle it with violence, and yeah, like some of it was parts memories of murder, but at the same time, there's no country for old men. In Birdshot, like there's a lot of very western elements. Even the choice of like doing the finale in like a cornfield instead of the typical Filipino rice field.
Mhm.
But also those elements also make it, I guess, new to a local audience that are more used to, especially like a Cinemalaya audience at the time, that were expecting something a bit more, like I said, found story or neo-realist, which I also did, by the way, with Neo Manila. But Birdshot felt different to them in like a sense of like spectacle in a way. I mean, it's not a big movie, but there was a certain language to it. Like we were very precise, for example, with the camera. Like it was always on a dolly or always on a crane. And in fact, a fun fact is the house in Birdshot, we built it
Mhm.
on a piece of land where we also planted the cornfield. So everything was very bespoke, very precise. It was
Mhm.
storyboarded, so you could really move the camera around. Meanwhile, Neo Manila was like handheld, real locations, real crowd. We shot in like a public market where there was like an assassination. So totally different techniques, but that birdshot approach kind of, admittedly, it had a bigger audience than, let's say, Neo Manila did. A lot of people don't know that Neo Manila had a theatrical run 1 week before Erie, and that was quite like it was like a big uh I guess illustration of the whole audience and distribution situation for me, because I had two movies coming out, very different movies. Neo Manila, politically charged neo-realist gritty crime thriller that played in international festivals, that was more, a bit more personal, more passion project with very small budgets, with people who just wanted to help make the movie. And then I had Eerie, this major studio release with popular actress horror movie ghost story, and they were released 1 week apart. I remember the first day Neo Manila came out, I invited some of my staff who worked on the movie to come and watch with me in a local mall. And when we went there and bought tickets, we were the only ones. Like if we didn't buy the tickets, they wouldn't have shown the movie. So we went there and we watched the movie. And then a week later, Erie did like $5 million and was like sold
Wow.
out everywhere. So I mean, I'm not saying like I prefer one over the other, but it was like an illustration of the whole situation to me. And I kind of like woke me up and made me kind of like take a step back and be more objective and understand why this why this works, why this doesn't, why audience gravitates towards this, and what we can do to kind of find the balance. And it was very interesting. It's hard to do it, because that's the goal, right? To find that balance between the two. um it's easier said than done. So
Do you
so yeah, we're still trying to um make it work.
you think that response was purely to do with it, the maybe the less enthusiastic public response to Neo Manila had anything to do not only with it being more of a gritty neorealist art house film, but rather also maybe the politically tendentious character of the drug war and you know, Duterte having broad public
Yeah,
support, right? And really, it's a minority, very, I think, relatively
the
small,
progressive, yeah,
very
well, yeah,
small.
it's definitely, one of the reasons. But of course, another big factor was, marketing. Of course, it's a more independent film, um, and it's also, realistically, the mass audience gravitate towards more escapist cinema. That's why I guess recently horror has been doing well, because horror is still the type of genre where they would watch with their friends or as a group, and after a jump scare, after a scare, everyone would laugh, right? Like it's almost like a release of emotion. It's like a roller coaster ride. So you can kind of like see the similarity of like a horror and a comedy in that like escapist release of emotion versus something that's so close to reality, like a gritty crime thriller about how rotten everything is. Of course, if you're like a working class, Filipino with like saved up some money for months to go watch a movie, you can kind of understand, of course, like which film they'd prefer.
Mm,
So yeah, I mean, it's understandable that there is a niche audience with these types of movies, and but luckily Neo Manila is soft financed, by the government grant and by Q Cinema. So yeah, it was more like a bonus, basically the theatrical, and now with Amazon, it's all like just a bonus to us. Just making the film was a triumph and like an accomplishment for us, and getting it shown in film festivals, and even like in like Activista and like these more progressive human rights film festivals showed it. So it was pretty fun, like traveling with the movie and talking about the whole drug war situation with Neo Manila. Um, so I guess it's very different films, and you really, as a filmmaker, as a Filipino filmmaker, trying to make a career and out of this and make it your make a living out of it, but at the same time you want to keep making movies, you need to find and understand, that balance. You can probably do both, like you said with Lino Broca, and they were already doing it back in the 70s. So yeah, I mean, you have to find a way to do it. I mean, another filmmaker who is like that is maybe like, if you know June Lana. He also makes very commercial movies. He does like Haunted Mansion and horror movies, but he also does like, yeah, the movie that just showed in Toronto. He did like Die Beautiful. Um, so he's one of the also like a prolific veteran filmmaker, almost like Eric Mati.
mm,
So these are filmmakers who really found like a way to kind of balance it. Like they run their own studio, they make commercial movies, and then they make their art house movies, and they that
mm.
play in festivals. So I guess that's like the pattern that you see with a lot of Filipino filmmakers that are exclusively feature film directing. Of course, there are some that
Mm.
dabble in like TVC and television.
So as I understand it, the new cinema, or I guess they call it what, the second golden age, Lino Broca, Ishmael Bernal, where they were sort of anti anti Hollywood in certain respects. Lino Broca talks about the problem of the national audience is that they're steeped in the quagmire of Hollywood films. But then, of course, he made all of these very melodramatic films that maybe were designed for a niche Filipino audience, but were certainly genre films. Um, and as I understand it, they sort of had a program, and it's not clear to what extent they fulfilled it, but they were sort of reacting, this is my interpretation, to like the Hollywood films of the 1960s, the West, like the Pansett Westerns, and they wanted to like the wooden acting, they wanted dramatic realism and documentary aspirations. That's how one person put it. So they sort of had an aesthetic program of sorts. Is there something similar that you have or that filmmakers who are making films now in your generation have that is pitched against the previous decade or two of films? Are you reacting to like the Mendoza Lav Diaz kind of art house films, or the documentary approach of Brilliante Mendoza? Is the genre approach a kind of a reaction to that? Is it programmatically a response?
I guess maybe subconsciously as well. Like like maybe the newer generation also wants to, have their own identity, differentiate themselves. Like even with like the latest the latest like Sundance films of like the younger generation, they're a bit more absurdist. There are genre elements, but at the same time they're very absurdist. I don't know if you've seen like uh Leonore Never Die, which played in Sundance by Martika, uh
I didn't
and
know.
she's like a younger, first feature, I think, younger director. So it was a bit more dark comedy absurdist that talked about action genre cinema, and it was also a film about film. And then you have also in Sundance, a good friend of mine, Kenneth Dagatan, did a horror movie called In My Mother's Skin, which is a period set horror movie, set in World War II, but it's about the aswang, like the Filipino monster vampire, a fairy, diwata and aswang. But uh, so it's genre, but has that elevated, sensibilities. So you can see like these younger filmmakers, younger than me, even like in their late 20s. I'm 31 now. They're in their late 20s. They already with their first or second feature films in these top festivals. They're already showcasing, Filipino genre. So there's that push towards that. I guess you can kind of see it. Maybe this is also the generation that grew up with streaming, with Korean cinema, with access to a lot of Hollywood, but at the same time, still very Filipino in its milieu and its storytelling, and it's the characters and the historical context is still very Filipino, but it has a lot of these very polished genre Western aesthetic sometimes. That obviously, like you can tell, like some of their influences are like A24 films. So that there's like that new generation finding quite the success, in these elevated genre movies. Um, and it's more sustainable for them as well because it's picked up by streamers. It has a wider audience than something a bit more niche like a neorealist film, for example. So yeah, so you can see that trend, I guess, but I don't know if it's like more like a subconscious thing or it's like just circumstance in the environment and our influences, our generation's influences. um I mean, not just us, like even like the newer genre films from the US, like are you can kind of see the rise of the elevated genre film, the elevated horror. So yeah, there's that. Even like Cannes, Venice, right? They program a lot of genre films. Rotterdam is now programming like a genre section. So there's that push. Filipino action is also having a resurgence. I think Richard Somes and Eric Mati are doing a lot of action movies. Eric Mati is doing By Bus 2.
Okay.
And then Richard Somes just played like a over the top, like wild action brutal movie called Topak that played in like Fantastic Fest in Austin. So
Mm-hmm.
these are like major Western film festivals, and they see the merit in these more slick, genre films, and almost like The Raid from Indonesia. You see the rise in these types of movies now, and I guess it's because Filipinos are also seeing the success in it, and it's I mean, it's exciting as well because, like I said, like rom-coms are slowly declining, and it's a bit more diverse now in terms of uh films. In fact, last year after the Deleter in this year's MMFF, we saw like a bigger submission of like genre and horror compared to before, where it's mostly comedies. So there's that big shift towards genre.
Are you personally shifting away from that with like Dead Kids and then this fencing film, which are less sort of identifiably, you know, genre films, and they're dealing maybe more with a specific sociological question, right? The Filipino upper middle class,
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
I guess I feel like even though like you mentioned, like there is that very upper middle class element to it, like fencing or like a sports movie, it's it's still in the Filipino psyche that we're very aspirational. Like even with our teleserye, our like noontime TV shows that are aimed more for like the working class or the people at home during the afternoons, it's always like this orphan who gets adopted by a rich family and has to live in a mansion. There's that appeal, that career fantasy, that level up, elevation and aspiration. So I see it as a good thing, like especially now knowing that there will be a lot of horrors because it's the new in thing now. Even after the Deleter, I mean, I'm guilty of that as well. But now that there's gonna be like a resurgence, and there's gonna be a lot of like these more darker, grittier R-rated movies. I feel like eventually the shift is gonna go back to something more less cynical, I guess, more upbeat. Like that's why I'm focusing more this time on like sports dramas or like underdog stories that maybe has a more wider general audience because everyone likes to cheer for an underdog and um achieve their dreams. So we're going with that now, like something a bit more nationalistic as well. So like playing for a national sports team, but in a very niche sport like fencing, I feel like could work. I mean, I'm not sure yet, but we really believe in that. We believe in the idea of that it can be like a good underdog story. Because again, it's a perspective of a scholar who has to go up against the elite that are more, used to fencing and has to learn this sport and excel in it. So there's that aspirational career fantasy to it that
Mhm.
we feel will work, and it's female fencing as well. Um,
Is it your
and yeah,
intention
and
to at
maybe
all kind of subvert that aspiration, or not necessarily? That's not necessary.
there is an element there where we also want to subvert the genre where it's not just your typical Karate Kid bully, like there's a certain frenemy type of relationship with like the upper middle class antagonist character with the protagonist, and they kind of develop this understanding where they're both pressured by like different variables in their lives. So there is that element to it. Like we don't want to make a good guy, bad guy type of sports drama like 80s, like Rocky or there is that uh,
Ratio
different
Elder.
dynamic. Yeah, and it's uh, two you know um uh female characters from different backgrounds as well. Like one will be a very popular again, a very popular actress, but the other one we want to discover like a new face, like a audition basically for someone a bit more relatable, more ordinary, and then go through this training process. We feel like would really work. So that's one. And we also one thing we also want to develop is both animation and sci-fi. And we feel like that's something that's rarely done here because of course, the production value and the challenges of it. If you saw the news recently, our national Oscar entry, the international foreign language entry for the Oscars, is an animation movie.
I didn't see.
That won in Cinemalaya. It was a big winner in Cinemalaya. It was like a rotoscope. They
Mm.
shot live action, green screen rotoscope, and turned it to animation. The Missing. So you can check that out as well. So it's interesting because we want to support that. We want to develop those more ambitious, breaking the mold type of films that are still genre, sci-fi and some like we want to support sci-fi projects, animation projects, and sports movies with this new studio outfit that we're trying to make work, right? And we want to kind of show as well the international community that we can make quality, entertaining genre films. We have the talent. We just need the resources sometimes, and we need the distribution opportunities that not just because we're already very successful and popular in like the film festival art house route. Ever since there's always a Filipino entry, but now we also want to show that we can compete in a regional genre films. Try to be like Indonesia or Thailand. Like Thailand was very successful. Like films like Bad Genius. That's one of our inspirations as well for like Dead Kids, right? It's a very popular, successful, and yet well made and well received movie. So yeah, that's like our philosophy now, and that we're trying to encourage filmmakers to kind of pursue that.
Well, I'm sorry I'm keeping you so long. It's getting quite late over there. So maybe I can just wrap up with one last question
Okay,
then.
yeah.
Yeah, if you can, and then we can end it. Can you just sort of describe how the in broad strokes how the industry right now is the local industry is interfacing with the international streaming platforms, and then how does that feed into your strategy with Evolve Studios?
Uh, um, without getting like into more specific numbers, because it's very aggressive now. Like even with the streamers themselves, they're of course they're competing for content. Um, yeah, a lot of smaller studios. This one is fairly new. We're just starting, but a lot of because they're like big broadcast channel distribution production companies like ABS or GMA or Regal. They've been around. Viva has been around, but there are smaller main D, they call them main D, like mainstream indie, main D like companies that are producing movies. Yeah, they rely on the streaming revenue. So what they do is they make smaller like these, 7 to 10 shooting day type of movies, and then they sell them as a package instead of one by one. They do like a 5 picture deal with one streamer, another picture deal, and these are like straight to streaming. You know, Sometimes they would do the second window option, but basically the theater is just a bonus, meaning sometimes you can notice they don't even fully promote. They don't spend on like commercials, like TV broadcast spots for trailers. That's expensive, that's in the millions. They don't put up billboards or bus ads. They just release it in the cinema, see how much they can make. Sometimes it's gone after 2 days. And that's just a bonus because the main intent is to just bring it to streaming, and the streaming purchase already covers the budget. So these are very small budgets. So they do it in multiples. And then you see some that go through the festival route first, gather some acclaim and prestige and some laurels, and then they do the theatrical. Sometimes it helps, sometimes, but not a lot. It's more a very niche audience, and then they still go straight to streaming. Usually Amazon is more aggressive now because they're the newer, streamer on the block.
Mhm.
So they have to be more competitive because Netflix has been around longer. It's very rare for like Filipinos to have more than one streaming. You'd have to be middle class, upper middle class, or a film buff to have more than one streaming platform legally. You know,
Mhm.
a lot of Filipinos are clever, so they pirate most of their content. But yeah, I mean, streaming here is almost like like phone lines. You only have one. Like you only subscribe to one internet or one phone line. You don't get multiple unless you're a film buff or upper middle class, or you're really into that. But yeah, so it's a lot of straight to Netflix movies, a lot of straight to Amazon. The bigger studios like Viva have their own streaming now, like Viva One, which had Deleter in some territories, and they're also international because they target the Filipino diaspora and like people in a lot of the Arab countries and in those territories, those overseas Filipino workers. That's where they get most of their content from, like the Viva One, Viva Max. They target like the OFW community there, so it's still Filipino targeted, even though it's an international streaming service. Um, and yeah, I mean that's like maybe 90-95% of the films now. The rest compete for that very small chance to be the next big theatrical release. Because, like I said, the how I illustrated it, it's like the business model is 10 movies and then one will make so much money, the other nine will flop. In fact, the Metro Manila Film Festival, which is like the most sought after slot because it's a guaranteed local release slot where you don't have to face off against Dune 2 or like a Star Wars movie. Um, Only like the first four sometimes of the eight films will make the money. Because again, even if they guarantee eight movies a local slot, some malls in the provinces just have two or four cinemas. So it's still their choice to choose the best two out of the eight to show in their cinemas, unless they do like a staggered screening. So it's very competitive, but like I said, you will make so like one film can make enough money to produce the next 10 or 20, and then you do that cycle all over again where
Mm.
90% will flop and then one film will get the budget for everything again. So that's like the structure now theatrically, and then the package pito pito structure for the streaming.
Mm.
So that's in a nutshell, that's like the commercial way to do it. And then of course you still have the grant funded projects that have to compete in like pitching programs like what we did with Birdshot or New Manila, where you take it outside. But those films take 4 or 5 years to make. Typically, if you wanna gather enough grants, assuming you keep winning them, it's very competitive. Assuming you keep winning grants, you need like 4 or 5 years worth of same cycle submission, submitting to the same programs to finally have enough money to shoot it.
So you were the first, I guess, to kind of break into the Netflix. You had the first Netflix original film. Is that going to continue with your the Evolve Studios? Are you still sort of thinking of new ways to use this revenue stream and distribution network to sort of as a
Yeah, I mean we're still, I mean the good thing about working with streamers is now you have a network, they know you, you know them. They're one email away, so it doesn't guarantee anything. I mean, at least you can still send them your film and see if they're open to taking it as an original. But now that streamers have been around for longer, they have their own metrics now. They know what works. They know what people, they have the data because they can see that people like stop watching after 10 minutes. So they kind of know like what genre works. And now they're being a bit more selective, and they understand what the Filipino audience wants, I guess, and it's more competitive now to get like an original label. And sometimes it's weird because sometimes the smaller films are the ones that now get the original label because it's easier to market, or it's easier to digest as well. It's not something too ambitious or too over the top that misses the mark with an audience. So there's that structure to it. But me personally, I still want to crack like the theatrical route, and to find what resonates with the mass audience. And the local audience in cinemas, because that's what we want, right? That we want to have like that, the equal value and share like against these big Hollywood films in cinemas. We want Filipinos to support Filipino movies in the big screen. So we're always aiming for that, and then streaming is usually like our second window option.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, so I feel like maybe if we continue, getting the right cast with the right story, it can resonate with a larger audience, and that's what we try to do.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mikhail, for taking the time to talk with me about this. Very interesting.